Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Ayo Akinwolere. So this week on The Athletic, we're focusing on the people that own the 20 clubs that make up the Premier League. So who are they? How much does it cost to buy a team? And what do they get in return? I'm joined by The Athletic's Adam Crafton and Matt Slater as well. Matt, through time, the makeup of the different stakeholders in the Premier League has changed. Just give us an insight on how it's changed over time.
Oh, massively. Look, I know football didn't start in 92. It gets very frustrating for old men like me, or old people like me, when people sort of think that there was nothing that happened before 1992. But it is quite a good before-after moment, isn't it? So if we think about that first Premier League season, 92-93, there were 22 clubs in the top flight. It took them a few years to get to 20. 21 of the 22 were owned by Englishmen, and it was Englishmen back then. The one exception to the rule was an Anglophile Lebanese businessman, colourful character, Sam Haman, who owned Wimbledon. And he came to London in the 70s because of he had a young family, and Lebanon was a dangerous place back then as well, right? And he actually settled in Wimbledon because he was a tennis fan. Ended up buying the football team, and look, and whilst, and this is the funny thing about everyone thinks about 1992, everything changed. It didn't. In lots of ways, the football didn't change, right? And not much happened in the 90s. Like the next few deals were Brits buying Brits out, or clubs like Nottingham Forest, for example, going from a sort of ownership structure that hadn't changed for 100 years, like 200 blokes that owned small shares. Southampton was very similar as well, to sort of becoming something slightly more professional, something that we sort of would recognise now. And it wasn't really till we got into the noughties. There was an Icelandic takeover. I think that was at Wimbledon, actually, again. It wasn't really till we got to the noughties where we had a decade of revenue growth, a decade of the TV product growing, the player profiles growing, right? So, what we saw in that first decade was a predominantly British-Irish league with English owners and local fans becoming more international. It wasn't really until we got to the noughties, and I think the big one, and I'm sure we'll get a bit more into this, was Roman Abramovich. That was the revolution, because then 2 years later we had the Glazers, and then what started as that sort of, I wouldn't say it was a trickle, because those two were big moments, right? The biggest club, Man United, gets bought by a leveraged buyout. We'd never seen that before. Roman Abramovich, the whole Chelsea revolution, the money, wow. And then really over the last 10 years, I would say we've gone from this thing that was sort of happening, that we were sort of vaguely aware of, to, it's happened. It's almost too late. If you had a problem with it, it's too late. And we'll never put that toothpaste back in the tube. And now it's almost completely flipped. If we were to have this conversation, I was looking at all the clubs that are for sale at the moment. I think it's not that much of a reach to say if we were to do this in a year or so's time, it could be the complete reverse of what it was in 92, with only one English club in fully wholly owned, majority controlled English ownership. And I think that's probably Brighton. Tony Bloom looks like the most sort of secure, long-term, not for sale guy out there. The other clubs, I think there are probably 4 in total that I say are majority controlled, and they are, Brentford, which of course big rivalry, Tony Bloom, personal rivalry, Matthew Benham. They've got a minority stake up for sale at the moment. There's Spurs, I would put in that camp. They are for sale. And then there's West Ham, and they are very much for sale. There's a minority stake there, and they've already got a big Czech minority owner, and they've got an American minority owner as well. So 4, I would say, are kind of English controlled at the moment, but that could easily be one in a year or so's time, 2 years' time.
Yeah, Adam, can you just give us then a sense of what those stakeholders look like? We've talked about how it's evolved from predominantly English-Irish ownership to the Abramovich era, which is almost a distant memory now. Where are we now? Who's sitting around the table?
Well, I was looking yesterday, partly because I was late writing my piece, which is meant to go tomorrow, which is on the US ones. And kind of extraordinary to think just less than 20 years ago, there wasn't an American owner. right, in the Premier League. You know, you're talking 2004, 2005. That doesn't feel that long ago when you say the words 2004, 2005. But it is a long time ago, and a lot's happened in those 2 decades. So I suppose the way you kind of boil it down now is you've got the British investors, you know, as Matt was saying, people like Tony Bloom, Matt Benham, Jim Ratcliffe, not a majority owner, but, you know, it feels like he's running the show for now, at least at Man United. You then have golf investors, the sovereign wealth funds. You've got Man City, Abu Dhabi, Newcastle, Saudi. And then really increasingly, it feels like the rest is America, right? North America. And by the way, you know, I think it's now 9 of the Premier League clubs majority owned by American investors, or if you were to put together the stakes owned by American investors, that's going to become bigger. You know, if the Friedkin families looks like it's going to get Everton in the next couple of months. They're the guys who own Roma. And then, as Matt says, you know, when you're looking at who might buy stakes in Tottenham, West Ham, Brentford, it's going to come from North America, you know, almost certainly. You know, there's only so many sovereign wealth funds that have the means or the willingness to get involved. You know, sometimes, you know, people, I think, still have a feeling maybe Qatar will do something else at some point, but let's see. Bahrain, maybe, who knows, right? But unlikely. They haven't shown a willingness so far. So from a golf point of view, it's hard to see too much more coming in. The Chinese investment has dried up into English football compared to where we were maybe 8 to 10 years ago. You know, Jim Ratcliffe was the richest guy, one of the richest guys in Britain, and he's only taken a 27% stake in Man United. Of course, he could do more. He may well do more as time goes on. So this investment, increasingly, and even when we talk about North American investment, I think maybe 20 years ago, even 15 years ago, we might have talked about family offices. You know, families, people like the Glazers, the Kronkers. And there are still families, right, that can do this. But increasingly, even when it is families that are doing it, they're going to be using institutional money, right? Private equity, funds, and all of these funds, they can take so many different forms. It can be, as we've seen at Ipswich. I mean, if you've not read it yet, go and read Matt's piece that he did with Ipswich's owners a couple of weeks ago on The Athletic. You know, that's a pension fund, right? Slightly scary, like the idea of like pension funds, you know, rolling the dice on English football clubs, but it's part of a portfolio. University endowments might get involved. You know, the type of funding that you're going to see is very, very different to the guy who's made a bit of money in his local club and wants to put it back in. John Henry, the Liverpool owner, or the owner of FSG, who have the largest stake in Liverpool, said to the FT earlier this year that the sports industry has gone from these mom and pop operations to serious sports businesses, robust, competitive businesses, and that's the journey that we're seeing, and that's what it looks like around the Premier League table. And the really interesting bit may be, and we're not far away, when North American investors are the majority in terms of voting rights around the Premier League table, right? Once you get out, it's 14 votes to be able to pass rules out of the 20 clubs. Once you get over 14, I think that's when, I don't think it's too alarmist to say what might happen from there. What ideas do North American investors have to grow, in their eyes, the Premier League? Because a lot of their investors want returns down the line.
Well, I definitely want to come on to that a little later on. And Matt, as Adam's saying all this, you know, the different stakeholders, and we've gone through it, you know, from US to Gulf states to wherever else in the world. I wonder if this is just reminiscent of any other sort of major area where big money is spent. You know, I look at the art world and you look at how the dynamics have changed from UK ownership of art to now US Chinese, because they're the only ones that can really pay that big sum of money. Is this just yet another indication of how things are moving around the world and who's got the money right at this moment in time? You know, that classic businessman from the UK just hasn't got that much wonga in his pocket anymore.
Well, the short answer is yes, right? So there's a few bits to that. I'll give you a slightly longer answer. Well, UK PLC, this laissez-faire island off continental Europe has been for sale for 400 or 500 years. That was the sort of strength of that was why we had an empire, right? We were a trading nation. We weren't we were open for business. That was the idea, and it's still the idea. It's been the idea for the last certainly 30, 40, 50 years of my life. And you can see it in the City of London. You can see the investments made in sort of buildings, student housing, you name it, care homes, our water companies. This is an old story, right? We do not, well, we do because we do sort of obsess about it, but we are more open to foreign ownership than particularly our European cousins. As I said, be it newspapers, banks, whatever. So there's that, right? That is not unusual. And then I think there's the sort of specific thing about the Premier League. The Premier League has gone from being, one of a handful, good domestic leagues, where the old business model was, as you said, a local Mr. Big, someone showing off, someone giving something back. But, that sort of kind of more local, parochial relationship between owner, club. But then who was in the stands, right? Local people. Who was on the pitch? Local people, by and large. And then sort of TV comes along, shakes things up. So the big clubs were not the city clubs. It wasn't about the size of your stadium. It wasn't how good you were was related to your ticket revenue. So now it's TV. That takes you beyond your local reach. Suddenly sponsors become interested, more not just local sponsors. So that's been the sort of progression, right? Now the Premier League has just emerged. For whatever reason, be it position in the globe, time zones, the English language, the fact that the Premier League came along, that Sky came along and did at that crucial time when TV technology was changing the world, making the transmission of live stuff much cheaper, much more accessible. The Premier League just got it. Those clubs, those Englishmen who I sort of was a bit rude and disparaging about in my first answer, the sons of butchers and paint dealers and market traders, remarkable stories. That 92 class of owner, we're talking about many of them self-made men. Those guys spotted it. Those guys ring-fenced the top flight, so they broke away and they got basically into a partnership with Sky Sports, pay TV revolution, and it did transform our top flight. So we are now that kind of premium product. And it's remarkable. That's happened in my lifetime. Now our clubs are trophy assets. Now the values of them has just gone up exponentially. I mean, in the piece I've done on the Brits that are remaining, the values of their clubs have just gone, we're talking hundreds, 200, 300 times in 30 odd years. Ken Bates bought Chelsea for £1. Right. David Dean, when he was buying up shares in Arsenal, he was buying them from their old Etonian, the families that kind of ran the club for sort of decades and decades. They thought he was mad. They said to him, "You're crazy. This is dead money. Who spends money on football shares?" He spent something like 300 grand buying up Arsenal shares in the 80s. Incredible. That club's worth 3-4 billion now. Okay, he's exited, but he made tens of millions. So this is what's happened, that the clubs have got, our rich guys aren't rich enough, but as Adam's kind of pointing out, there's not many rich guys that can do this on their own. We're talking about, we've gone beyond their billionaires being richer than our billionaires. We're now talking about, their billionaires have to club together into syndicates and private equity and hedge and all that sort of stuff. Or we're talking sovereign wealth, national wealth. So the funny thing is, I did sort of say that it's possible if we were to do this in a year or so's time, we'd only have one left. Well, Tony Bloom's a rich guy. He's a genuine billionaire. He's in the Sunday Times rich list. He appears at the bottom of the kind of global billionaires list. He's a rich guy, and he has that close connection with Brighton. Our richest guy, his actual wealth fluctuates. He's Sir Jim Ratcliffe. I think he's third or fourth richest Brit at the moment. But that's just because his company fluctuates. It's just the nature of what they do. Petrochemicals.
Is he going to be all right? Dropping down.
Well, I think he's going to be absolutely fine. No one worry about Sir Jim. He's not dropping too much further.
He ain't struggling. Trust me.
My point is, it's still possible for our richest guy, If Dyson wants to buy one, I don't know if so they can still do it if they want to. And so Jim Ratcliffe has clearly decided he's reached the point in his life where he wants to have fun. He's going to try and win the America's Cup. He's going to try and win Tour de France. He's going to try and buy his boyhood club. Don't forget, he also tried to buy Chelsea. So it can still be done. And I actually think, funnily enough, there is a road to full control for him there. So he could be the other one in a few years' time. The Glazers, I think, are gradually on their way out because I think they've milked that cow for all. They're on their way. But I think the bigger point is it takes Sir Jim Ratcliffe wealth. We're talking about sort of 25, 30 billion, that sort of wealth. There aren't many of those people out there. They just aren't.
Do you know what's funny though, Matt? I was at the SoccerX conference in Miami last week, where, for people that don't know, SoccerX is kind of one of these football conferences where you get owners, investors in sports teams, particularly football teams. You get all sorts of lawyers, league representatives, deal makers, etc. And at the same time as we're saying it's too expensive, one of the big incentives for US investors, if they want to get involved in sport, is they actually see English football, unless the Premier League, I know not to make this conversation too broad, but actually Championship, League One, lower end of the Premier League, as a low price entry point into, because if you go around the world and you say Premier League, to many people that's bigger than NFL, even NBA, right? That doesn't quite bear out though in terms of valuations. Right, the valuations of NBA teams and NFL teams are, the cheapest NFL team is the most expensive Premier League team. Right, that's where we're at now. And if you look at the media rights, this is where, when I say to American investors, why are you putting money into Premier League clubs? Right, collectively in the last full year we have of full accounts, Premier League clubs together lost $1 billion. Right. Day to day, these clubs are losing money. Manchester United, the last 5 years, have lost £370 million. Right? You can say the player trading's been terrible, all these different things, but if Man United can't make money, what chance have the other guys got? Is what you could look at it and say. Particularly like when you look at what their revenue is, and what these guys say is you look at the media rights of the NFL, right? Which really you're just talking there about largely a domestic market. Their 11-year deal at the moment is worth something like 110 billion. It's worth over 10 billion a year. The Premier League, which is, by the way, by far and away the biggest from a football soccer point of view, they're bringing in 3.3 to 3.5 billion a year, right? So if you look at that, they're saying that can grow, right? That can still grow. We sometimes look at that and think, how much more can this thing grow? How much more can this thing grow, right? The last TV deal didn't look like it was going to grow that much, but this is one of the areas where they see big opportunity. Because if you think about it, a lot of the things that Americans would really like to do with English football, they can't do politically, right? So things like they might look at US sport, they see a closed league, right? No promotion, no relegation, safeguard, guaranteed revenues. They can't really do that here yet. Whether they'll try in the future, who knows, right? But it's not something they've seriously tried to do. Games abroad, right? Again, politically very difficult to take competitive games abroad. Actually, I think it's something that will happen eventually. Other things that they'd love to do, I was told a story about an owner who was looking at his stadium, sold out. Stadium is sold out every week, big waiting list. He goes in, talks to his executive management team and says, guys, why are our tickets so cheap? We're sold out. We have a waiting list. What are you doing, right? Why aren't these prices higher? This is how the market works, right? In the States, in most companies, most businesses, right? Why, when we have demand, are we not increasing the prices? You can't do that in English football, or you can, but you'll become very unpopular very quickly. So those are some of the areas where growth should in some ways be logical, but is actually quite hard to execute. And then you're left into the realms of, okay, can you do player trading really effectively? We've seen Liverpool do that, we've seen Brentford do that, we've seen Brighton do that. Increasingly though, everyone now has data scientists. Everyone has scouts worldwide. So being that differentiator that can really make money through player trading is increasingly difficult. I think Brighton still seems to be able to do it, right? You know, you look at what they've done the last few years. Brentford's recruitment hasn't been, you know, you look at their squad, actually, a lot of their best signings seems to be the guys that were playing 3 years ago or so. It's not been as effective the last couple of years. Liverpool, you know, towards the end of Klopp, it's a bit TBD, right? People like Nunez, big signing, still working out what's going on there. So some of these ways of making money, you know, we'll do it smarter, we'll be more dynamic from a commercial point of view. I think it's getting harder. And then you get into, and sorry, I know this answer's longer than you want it to be. I was listening to an interview that one of the founders of Ares, which is one of the big private equity funds, I think it's called Tony Ressler, was talking about. And he was talking about global sports as a 3 trillion sector. And they've made investments now into Chelsea, Atletico Madrid, I think McLaren Racing, as an investment into Eagle Football that owns Lyon and Crystal Palace. We'll see how well that one turns out. But I'm sure they'll get, you know, these funds tend to get their money back as a rule. They probably won't be the ones that do badly out of it. But he was saying in this interview that you can't just think now of a sports team, a football team, as just sport. You have to think about it as all the ancillary businesses that you could link to a sports team. So it's the stadium project, it's the infrastructure, it's the real estate in the area around the stadium, it's the tech company that might be linked in some way, the software, it's food and beverage. All of these different things, you have to think of it as an opportunity into. And I think when you start to frame it in that way, it starts to look like a much better opportunity than a company that is day to day losing 20, 30, up to £100 million a year.
All right, joining us now to discuss the level of investment that has gone into the Premier League clubs, we have the Athletic's Phil Buckingham with us. Now, Phil, you kicked off our series today looking at when each ownership group took over and control, and more crucially, how much they have all invested. I mean, this was some undertaking, sir.
Yeah, it took a while. I had square eyes by the end of it, but I think it does give a pretty good understanding of how much these owners have invested in their clubs. I think at times the figures can be skewed by the length of ownership. I'll give you an example of Fulham. They're up the top of the chart, so to speak. But that Shahid Khan's been there for 2013, I think. So the level of investment there has been huge, but over a much longer period. But yeah, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly in there. I'll pick out three that already look like incredible investments. If you go back to the longest ownership we've got there at Spurs, you know, the money that has been paid for the club, obviously a long time ago, 20 years ago, and the subsequent investment, very low. And if we perhaps compare Spurs to like a Chelsea, the value of that club now is probably somewhere in the region of north of 2 billion. Got Liverpool, 300 million to buy that club 10 years ago. Very little owner investment compared to a lot of clubs on our list. And again, what price do you put on Liverpool? Perhaps in the same bracket as Manchester United, somewhere around that £3 to £4 billion mark. And I don't think you can ever have a conversation about investment in the Premier League without talking about Manchester United and the Glazers and the money that it took to buy that club. The relatively speaking, very low owner investment ever since. And there you are, you're talking about probably the biggest asset in all of the Premier League. And when you look down the list, the one other thing I would say is that there's a few clubs on there that explain why so many clubs in the Championship chance their arm. You know, how many clubs like a Derby, a Reading, because if you can spend just that right amount of money sensibly and cleverly, and you can establish yourself as a Premier League club, and you look down the list, someone like a Brentford, Tony Bloom's a bit different at Brighton, put huge amounts of his own money in. But then in Ipswich, these clubs were League One clubs not so long ago, and here they are in the Premier League. They've got a seat at the biggest table, and it's all been done for a relatively low amount of money. And there'll be people in the US listening to this and perhaps reading some of the figures in the article, and they'll be blown away by what amount of money you can get can get you a Premier League club compared to some of the major assets in American sport.
Just on that, Phil. Sorry to cut in here. Just if you just take Ipswich, what was it, 30 million that the original investment was when they were in League One? Is that right, Matt?
40, I think. Yeah.
Right. 30 million. They've gone from selling 10,000 jerseys a year to 100. They're forecasting 100,000 this year. They've gone from 13 million revenues to 153 million to 155 million. There'll be investors looking at that, right? Looking, God, they've made it look easy, right? Over the last 2 years, and thinking, I think we could do that, right? But that shows how quickly you can make that journey. And I think, just from that, just what we were saying earlier around, how you would expect there to be more Americans. It's not just, we were talking about maybe West Ham, Brentford, Tottenham, but actually if you look at the Championship, look at who's in the top 5 of the Championship right now. 3rd, 4th, 5th, you've got Leeds, Norwich and West Brom, all US owned. You've also got Sheffield United, who look like they're about to be taken over potentially. Sheffield United are always about to be taken over in a perennial state, but the latest link is a US private equity fund. So if you were to have 3, Sunderland I don't think is US owned, the 3 that you've got that could come up could be US owned. If you were to then take out Southampton, Leicester, and who else is down there? Wolves, right? Those 3 go. 3 US come up, right? Add Everton. You're already on to 13. Already on to 13. Then you've got West Ham, Brentford, Spurs. I mean, it's not unfeasible, right? It has to be the right makeup.
You'll be able to see any Premier League game you like in New York soon.
Exactly. And with dynamic pricing, it'll only be $1,200 a seat.
Well, you can see it on that massive widescreen they keep doing, the dome thing. You'll see it somewhere. But this does beckon the question, though, Matt. We look at, from Phil's graph anyway. The amount of ownerships of clubs that have changed since 2016, and I think that's without counting Man United. But we've kind of spoken about how this could be attractive to potential investors. But then I'm also thinking, of the days gone of that lifelong fan then who wants to hold on to this club, and do we start having a conversation about the lifespan of ownerships when it comes to football teams right now? Because, these are also sellable assets, and you can see people just being here for 5-10 years, and then boom, we'll sell it to the next highest bidder.
Yeah, everything's accelerated. There's no question of that. So if I go back to that kind of 92 picture, a lot of the clubs have been within families or within groups for decades. The Arsenal example, it was these 2 families. They'd had it for a long, long time, and it was on to like their 3rd generation. I think those days have gone, and they're even starting to go in the NFL. The NFL is probably the best comparison for the Premier League, because that's kind of where the Premier League is at, really, in terms of its sort of status within the game, within the sort of global game of soccer. It is the kind of dominant domestic league now, or the biggest domestic league. And NFL franchises, they have that scarcity value. They don't go up, they don't go down. They are not quite licenses to print money, but they certainly make money. They're not making any more of them. And people hold on to them, all right? And they've actually now got to the point where they are so valuable. And Adam makes lots of really, really good points. The sort of central, if you were to boil it down to one thing that makes sport so valuable, so precious to investors these days, it's TV. It's live entertainment. We time shift everything else. I don't really watch linear TV anymore. I like it. I've got a TV. I wait for people to tell me that something's good, all right, and then I watch it, and then I stream it, and me and my wife just, when people told me that I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here. I went to see my parents yesterday, and they were waiting to watch Wolf Hall, or the latest thing at 9 o'clock on BBC, and it just struck me as how quaint that was, that they were going to watch it in order, and they were waiting for the BBC to put it on for them. And I was just thinking, yeah, I'll get round to that in my good time. The one thing you can't do that to is sport. That's why sport's so valuable. It's 98, 99 of the top 100 viewed programs in the US every year, NFL games. That's what US investors are buying into. So things are changing. The rate of change has got really, really fast. You know, we haven't even talked about things like gambling, AI, the next advance in technology, how the Premier League really monetizes those fans in Asia and Africa that the NFL teams don't have. That's where things are going to really explode.
So I'll just come in on the. Matt's absolutely right, and it's also, you know, I was interested this weekend. You know, you've got the Tyson Paul fight, which was on Netflix, and I mean, look, no one really knows what a Netflix or an Apple will do with sport over the next few years. The winds of direction with that seem to blow and go hot, go cold, etc. But it's definitely something that in sports investors will have been very excited by, because when you think how much money has been spent on content by all of these platforms, you know, Amazon, Netflix. I mean, over here in the States, there's so many platforms. It's incredible, and it's so fragmented. They're all Netflix probably spent, I don't know what, billions and billions on content in the last 10, 15 years. But it's not really content you rewatch in the way that you would rewatch, I don't know, classic sitcom series like Friends or Curb Your Enthusiasm or things like that. What it tends to be is these content have moments, and then you're on to the next one. But live sport is kind of, it's only live. You can only watch it once. And it might be that some of these streaming companies do come to the view that actually, although it's super expensive, when we're always having to generate new content, this is what it is that we really choose to go with, sport, because we know people want to watch it. We know the demand's there.
Because I've sat through panels and heard private equity people talk about this. You're right. So they are talking about slightly longer investment horizons, to use the jargon. Right. So basically, instead of being 3 to 5 years, we're probably talking 5 to 7 years, maybe even about 8 years. And the buzzword is being patient money, right? And the rationale here is they feel this is a bit different to going and buying a tech stock or buying some sort of property-based asset. It just needs a little bit longer to percolate. And they're talking about the length of TV deals. So they are willing to wait a little bit longer for all those reasons we talked about, right? That they are convinced in themselves. They're convinced that live sport, live entertainment, football, blah, blah, blah. That's the thing that we want, and it's only going to get bigger. The rest of the world's getting richer. India's getting richer. China will come back. Africa's getting richer, right? This is good. We want to be in the right place. The right place right now for football is Premier League. For basketball, it's the NBA, and so on and so on. For cricket, it's the IPL. We need those assets. They are precious. We can wait. And then all the other stuff about betting and watch parties where you like going to see ABBA these days. You know, there's all that sort of stuff to come. So the other thing is that, and we sort of touched upon it a couple of answers ago, where Adam was talking about that kind of incredible explosion of asset value in sport in North America and why they're even looking elsewhere. And the way you value most sports teams is you just do a multiple of revenue. NFL's gold standard is pretty much 10 times your revenue. That's why their worst team is as valuable as our best football team. Major League Baseball, NBA, you apply slightly lesser multiple, 6 to 8 times. Those sports aren't quite as popular as the NFL. They don't do quite as well. They don't actually do nearly as well. But anyway, and then, you know, previously European sport was sort of double, 1.5 times, because of relegation, because of those losses. And what private equity of people have decided, and they are probably right-ish, if we're talking about really good teams, relegation isn't really an issue. That's why there's a premium for those top clubs. That's why there's a premium for those Champions League clubs, because you're in it. You're never going to get relegated. Your revenues are sort of kind of inching upwards, sometimes jumping upwards. It's a pretty safe bet. It's not quite relegation proof. It's not quite MLS or NFL. There is a risk, but it's minimal. So that is why they are much more confident about waiting. They're much more confident about getting involved. And if I go back to that North American example, just as a final thought, sport is being viewed as a really good defensive stock. So recessions, pandemics, whatever, You name it. Most normal companies, they go up and down. Sport values have just grown. In fact, they've outperformed the stock market in the States over the last 30 odd years. So people are talking about them as being defensive stocks, hedges, if you like. And that, again, is because they're trophy assets, because there's scarcity value, and it's because you and I are addicted. We are addicted to live sport, and we will keep watching. So all those things are why private equity is excited and is interested, and I think is willing to be a bit more patient.
The point I would make on that is that I think I've spent 20 years wondering when football's boom would come and when it would start to shrink again. And there is still absolutely no indication of that happening. You see with the domestic rights perhaps plateauing in more recent years, but you see the way the Premier League as a product has grown in the last 10 to 20 years internationally. The international rights keep going up and up and up, and there's a huge attraction in that because there's no indication that that's going to taper off anytime soon.
Yeah.
Do you want some stats to underline that?
Yes, please.
Throw them down.
Stats. So the Premier League now broadcasts to 189 of the 193 United Nations member states. In May, the Premier League said 1.87 billion people follow the division worldwide. How they work that out, I'm not sure. And 900 million homes globally are now able to watch Premier League football. And this is the interesting bit. 34% of the Premier League's followers said they became interested in the Premier League in the past 4 years. Right? So that's the other bit. When people are saying how much more can it grow, that's 34%, right, that have just come along. Now, what all these stats really mean is it's difficult to work out because, okay, 900 million homes can watch it. How many are watching it, right? 1.8 billion of people are following the division. Well, okay, what's that mean? Does it mean they're just checking the score? Does it mean they're buying merchandise? Does it mean they are members of subscribing to Man United's digital platforms in some way, which means they can get all the emails and newsletters and merchandise and all that sort of stuff? So some of that stuff's difficult, but the point is it's the most popular football league, right? And it's getting more popular. And the value of the asset is increasing. So when I say day-to-day Premier League clubs are losing money, I think increasingly it's kind of viewed as, well, okay, but the value of the asset is growing so much that will balance itself out down the line. The other thing is when at SoccerX last week, this new West Brom owner, Shalin Patel, was talking, and he actually, he was asked about the idea of most companies, if you do well, you take a dividend, right? Which in football, the Glazers aside, isn't really a thing because fans go mad about it. And he actually said, dividend, I consider to be, I've learned and seen what happened there, and it's seen to be a bad word, right? It is a bad word. And the understanding he says he has as an owner is what is made has to be reinvested, right? That's the kind of virtuous cycle, right? You make money, even if you're making a profit, that has to be reinvested into the club. And the rub of it, the balance out, is when you might sell at the end, that's when you cash in. And I think that's kind of, I think American investors have probably had a little bit of a bad rap based on the Glazers, right? With them being so defining over the last 20 years in terms of the perception. And yes, of course, right, Super League, yeah. But it wasn't just Americans, by the way, going into the Super League as well. And actually, I think that the model that most US investors in the Premier League have taken is really the kind of FSG, the Kroenke model, right? The self-sustaining. Every so often there might be a bit of owner investment, if we're really trying to go from A to B in a quicker amount of time or into an infrastructure project. But broadly, what a club makes is what it's going to spend. Then you get into a whole other debate about financial fair play and how that enables other clubs that have smaller revenues to compete. But I think the broad principle of US investment is, we don't want to just lose a load of money, right, constantly, and we want to be able to make money at the end, but generally we want a sustaining model, and that does seem pretty logical. Maybe I've become brainwashed over here.
I tell you what, we've spoken about the US, Phil, but we haven't talked about the Gulf states, Manchester City, Newcastle, City's owners have put in about £1.3 billion since taking charge in 2008, and the third longest serving owners. Is it possible for you to quantify just the impact of that ownership? And we've probably seen it in terms of trophies and Pep Guardiola being there, but also, for the Premier League in general, and how that has shifted the bar in essence.
I don't think it's any exaggeration to say they've changed the face of English football, haven't they? The ability to spend money and spend more than other clubs is nothing new. You can go back to the Bank of England clubs around the Second World War in the UK. You can go back to Jack Walker at Blackburn. And then it keeps getting ramped up a notch. Roman Abramovich at Chelsea, and then obviously what Manchester City did just took that to a whole new level. You can make a valid argument for Chelsea taking it to another level again with their spending, but when you look at Manchester City spending, the sheer weight of that all comes at the front end of their ownership, because it transformed Man City from a middling Premier League club, not doing a lot, not challenging for trophies. This injection of investment, and it's just completely changed Manchester City. They clambered past all these established clubs like Liverpool, like Manchester United, like Arsenal, to the point where Liverpool versus Man City in a title race, you're looking at Liverpool as the underdogs, and that's essentially what Manchester City have done in the Abu Dhabi reign. And I think a couple of points to make on this is, as I say, that the investment is very much front-ended in their reign, and when you look at the last 6 or 7 years, there hasn't been an awful lot of owner investment. They have become a self-sustainable club because they go furthest in the Champions League than any other Premier League club most years. They win the Premier League and all the prize money that comes with it. So what Manchester City bring in every year now doesn't need owner investment. It doesn't need the level of investment that you see at Aston Villa, that you've seen in Arsenal in more recent years. Now we can debate the legitimacy of the spend at the front end of the reign and the charges that hang over Manchester City, but that's what they've become, and the Gulf money that's come into Manchester City has changed the establishment, and that's where we are now. And can Newcastle get to those same levels? I think it's going to be a lot more challenging for them, because there's going to be a lot more obstacles placed in their way. Again, it's another argument over PSR and the future of that, but there's absolutely no question that the money that's come into the Premier League from the Gulf states, from Abu Dhabi, and more recently from Saudi, has just changed the establishment in English football.
Go back to Man City. One of the really, really clever things they've done, and we haven't really talked about it, is the multi-club investment. So they've done a huge amount of investment. So our focus is nearly always on Man City, and we forget that it's one of a large stable of clubs in very strategic places. It's not an accident that City Football Group own clubs in China, India, New York. They are where they feel they need to be. So that, again, is part of UAE's strategic investments and its desire to sort of kind of put its best foot forward. It's thinking very long term. We were talking about 7-8 years for private equity. The most patient money of all is sovereign money. Their investment horizons are 20-30 years, because we're talking about royal families. They are. There's a little bit of kind of job preservation going on there. In terms of the ruling families of these Gulf states. They have to diversify their economy. So that to me is nearly always number one. Sports washing, possibly very debatable. It's a contentious concept. Diversifying the economy is essential. Whether they're going to run out of fossil fuels or we're going to stop using them, I'm not sure what's going to happen first. I'd like to think it's the latter. They have to. They are one-trick pony. Saudi Arabia is a one-trick pony. It's an amazing trick, but they have to diversify their economy. He has to provide jobs for local people. He has to provide reasons for people to come to Saudi Arabia, both for holidays, but to bring their businesses. So sport is part of this big picture thing. So that's what's going on there. Is it working? We shall see. It's almost too early to tell. It seems like it might be. Are they overpaying? Yeah, maybe. What else are they going to spend their money at the moment? They're sprinkling it around on tech as well, and airlines, Adam's mentioned. We shall see, right? It poses massive problems if you're trying to run a football competition. Of course it does. But, that's a different pod.
No, I mean, let's be honest. Like the Premier League. I mean, how do they maintain control of this, Phil? You talk about all these different stakeholders, multi-billion-pound stakeholders. How on earth does a Premier League then control their invested interests? And Adam spoke about it earlier in terms of the way the Americans see the game and how they see growing sport.
Well, it's given the Premier League an almighty headache, one they couldn't have possibly foreseen when the Premier League was being set up 32 years ago. If you strip back the Premier League to what it was lots of local owners, felt very English, and then the expansion and the interest that's spiked in the Premier League has made it a very international league. I know it's based in England, but it feels very international now, and that's made it attractive to an awful lot of people. Regardless of the Gulf states coming into their motivations for coming into the Premier League, they're here now, and Saudi might have found it more difficult than Abu Dhabi did. Proving that distinction didn't seem too difficult in the end, when that political distinction, but they're here now, and it's an argument for hindsight whether or not the Premier League should have foreseen this problem coming over the hill. I think I'd argue it's very difficult, just because, as I say, what the Premier League was when it started, it was a simple domestic league in a country where most of its interest came domestically. And you look at it now, I don't think the Premier League could have possibly envisaged it becoming a vehicle for soft power, for diplomacy, for political gain. Yet here we are now. Manchester City's owners aren't going anywhere. There's no indication Newcastle United's are long term. So what are we left with? Do we see more Gulf states coming into the Premier League? I wouldn't rule it out. You saw the Qatari interest in Manchester United. We can debate how real that was. Jim Ratcliffe certainly hasn't he? But do we see other Gulf states coming into the Premier League? The door is open, and I'd argue that's what makes the Premier League and the UK perhaps different to Germany with their supporter stakes in clubs and the same in La Liga as well. That the UK has always been very open to investment, and the Premier League by extension as well. They've actively sought investment into the country, and this is the result of it. It's the very little legislation that would stop these things in private life, and the private companies, the investment that comes in from overseas. It's encouraged, and ultimately it's been encouraged into the Premier League, and no one ever drew a line to say that investment's okay.
It's not just the Premier League now who are encouraging it. I mean, the UK government in the USA now has people who are dedicated to matchmaking investors, right? With sporting institutions, whether it's Premier League clubs, whether it's the EFL, National League, ECB at the moment trying to sell 100 franchises. The government has realised that one of its increasingly few strong exports is sport, right? And therefore, they're trying to bring investment into the sector in the same way as they would in security or tech or healthcare, or in the same way as all of that, and with increasingly institutional money as well, and funds. They're able to say, well, take a bet on this, right? Come and get involved in this. Come and grow women's sport in the UK as well. So it goes back to what Matt said right at the start of this podcast. The UK is for sale, right? There's very little about the UK that wouldn't sell itself, right? And that's kind of the national story that is just being seen through a prism of sport. But when we think about football, we kind of get quite high and mighty about it, arguably rightly, because they are, we go down the road of their community assets and we must know everything about these people getting involved in our clubs, and there's all these local jobs at stake and local passion at stake. But the reality, the bigger picture is the UK is for sale.
And Matt, the UK is for sale, and Phil spoke about soft power, political gain, all things that potential investors could be licking their lips at. And I'm just thinking about who else might want a stake of this. We've spoken about Abramovich being
Yeah.
the great disruptor. I mean, I'm Nigerian.
Well-
Across the continent of Africa, football
Yeah.
is the diet of the people. I think Dangote said
Yeah,
he might have
Dangote.
wanted to buy Arsenal at some point. But, I mean, come on. That's not inforeseeable, is it?
No, of course not. So you're right. I think he still is Africa's richest man, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
Yeah. So that was a couple of years ago. He said he wanted to buy Arsenal for about $2 billion. I caught an interview with him, I think it was a month or so ago, where he's saying, I think my moment's passed. Arsenal are worth $4 billion now. I have that much of my wealth. I'm not spending that much. I'm doing with my hands here like an accordion. So no one drops all their wealth on a plaything. No one does that. Or a really good investment. It could be the most amazing investment in the world. You don't put the house on it, do you? So Dangote's being honest. He's saying, that's my club. I would love to buy Arsenal. I think he's worth about $10 billion, $11 billion. He built a private refinery, didn't he, in Nigeria? He's obviously a fascinating guy. There'll be another Dangote. If he's wed on Arsenal, then that ship might have sailed. But we had the Dozy Mbosi. That was a podcast we did.
Oh yeah, we did that, didn't we? Yeah.
Another Nigerian that doesn't have a private refinery, unfortunately, tried to buy Sheffield United.
Also hard to quantify his wealth as well, but that's a different
Yeah,
conversation.
Yeah. So, but look, there'll be an African club. There will be, and it'll be a great story, an amazing story for the Premier League. I think China will come back. The wave of Chinese investment we got about 10 years ago when President Xi decided he loved football has been a disaster for them and for all the clubs they bought. There's only one left, Fosun, Wolves.
What about India?
India will come. So talking about Ambani, I think he's worth about 100 billion. Obviously mad into cricket. He owns Reliance, big construction conglomerate. Then there's the other family, isn't it? Adani. They're kind of big rivals. Which one's richest at the moment? Obviously all over cricket. I think football will be next. Yeah, I think who knows where there's billionaires. We're making billionaires. We still make billionaires, and they club together if they haven't quite got enough.
Yeah, right. Let's end it there, gents. Really appreciate your time. Really in-depth conversation there, Matt, Adam, and Phil as well. Thank you for listening. We'll be back tomorrow. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.